A 6-year-old girl overhears dangerous whispers in the dark. Guards plotting against a powerful CEO. With only her teddy bear and her courage, she risks everything to save him. But what she doesn't know is that the man she's rescuing is the father she's never met. Before we dive into this heart-touching story, tell me, where are you watching from, and what's the time there right now? And if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and join our family. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the low rustle of leaves against the iron bars of the Grant estate, its towering gates gleaming under the pale wash of the moon, guarded by two men who spoke in hurried Italian, their voices sharp, tense, and laced with menace. And though their words slipped quickly between them, the tone alone carried shadows of cruelty. Just a few steps away, hidden near the ivy-covered corner wall, sat little Lily, a 6-year-old girl with hair like threads of spun gold, tumbling loosely over her small shoulders, her bright blue eyes glimmering with innocent curiosity, her tiny hands clutching a worn teddy bear pressed tightly against her chest, as if it were her shield from the darkness. She wore a sharp pink frock, neat and radiant even in the dim light, its hem brushing against her knees as she crouched low, her heart beating faster than the cicadas chirping in the distance. For she knew deep down that she was not supposed to be here. Yet children rarely followed rules when curiosity whispered louder than caution, and tonight, curiosity had carried her feet closer, closer, until the murmurs of the men's conversation curled into her ears like a secret meant never to be heard. The air seemed to freeze as one of the guards leaned toward the other, his words sliding out in rough Italian, yet Lily understood enough from the few English words scattered between. Tonight, we lock him inside, no food, no water. He'll beg for mercy. Her small fingers dug into the fur of her teddy as her eyes widened with shock, her chest rising sharply as if the very air had betrayed her. For she may not have known the full weight of adult schemes, but even a child could grasp the meaning of cruelty, and she knew they were speaking about someone important, someone powerful, the name whispered through every newspaper, every glowing television report. The Millionaire CEO, Alexander Grant, a man the world admired for his brilliance, but never truly knew beyond the glossy photographs and clipped speeches. Lily's tender heart, too young for politics, too untouched by greed, understood one thing only: danger, and danger was pressing its cold hand against someone's life. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, soft and warm, blurring the moonlight into streaks of silver. For though she was small, though her feet barely reached the pedals of her tricycle, though her voice often went unheard among adults, in this moment she felt the crushing weight of knowing something terrible, and the unfairness of being too little to stop it. She pressed her forehead to the cool stone wall, whispering into the night as though confiding in her teddy bear, yet her words trembled with a courage far beyond her years. I have to help him, even if I'm just little. The wind caught her whisper and carried it through the bars like a vow sealed with innocence, a vow born not of strength or power, but of compassion, the kind of compassion that only a child, untouched by the cynicism of the world, could hold in her heart. And in that fragile promise, a story began, one that neither the mighty gates nor the scheming guards could silence. For somewhere inside that grand mansion, a man of immense wealth sat unaware that his greatest savior was not an army, not the police, not his fortune, but a golden-haired girl in a pink frock who had just decided, against every fear and every obstacle, that she would become his light in the darkness. That night, long after the world had folded itself into sleep and the stars hung like watchful eyes across the black velvet sky, Lily tiptoed through the damp grass of the mansion's garden, her small bare feet trembling with every step, her teddy clutched tightly against her chest as if it alone could guard her from the unknown. Shadows stretching across the tall hedges. The air was thick with the scent of roses, yet it carried a chill that made her shiver as she pressed forward, following the faint, ragged sound of coughing that floated from somewhere hidden in the depths of the estate, a sound so fragile it seemed more ghost than human. And yet something inside her tiny heart told her this was the man she had promised to help. She crouched low, crawling under an arch of vines until she came upon a wooden shed tucked far from the path, its paint peeling, its corners swallowed by weeds, and from within came the broken gasps of someone fighting to stay alive. Her hands shook as she pushed the creaking door open, and in the dim flicker of moonlight streaming through a crack, she saw him, Alexander Grant, the powerful millionaire CEO, but nothing like the glossy photographs in newspapers or the crisp speeches on television. Here he sat slumped against the wall, his once impeccable tailored suit torn and smeared with dirt, his face pale with exhaustion, yet his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, still carried a fire, though dimmed, like a storm fading but refusing to die. For a moment, the little girl froze, breath caught in her throat, unable to reconcile the man she had heard adults praise with the wounded stranger before her, and yet something in his gaze called to her, as though he had been waiting all this time for someone, anyone, to come. His voice, hoarse and cracked, scraped through the silence as he tried to lift his head, each word trembling with weakness. "Who are you?" She clutched her teddy tighter, her small frame trembling but her spirit refusing to break, and she answered in a voice soft as wind through leaves. "I heard them. They want to hurt you. I came to help." Her words carried no power, no strategy, only the honesty of a child who could not walk away from suffering, and as they reached him, his chest tightened, not from the pain in his body, but from the unexpected tenderness of this tiny angel who had risked everything to stand before him. His lips parted again, barely able to form sound, yet his voice, though faint, held a fragile desperation. Why would you help me?" She swallowed hard, tears slipping down her flushed cheeks, and whispered with all the courage her little heart could gather, "Because you look lonely, and nobody deserves to be hurt." For a long moment, silence swelled between them, heavy and unspoken, broken only by his uneven breathing and the distant rustle of leaves, yet within that silence, something shifted, something deeper than words, for the mighty CEO who once believed the world was nothing but contracts and betrayals now sat staring at a child who had brought him bread, not with wealth, but with kindness, who had walked into the jaws of danger not with strength, but with innocence, and in that fragile exchange of glances, he felt something he had long forgotten. Hope. Delicate, yet fierce, blooming in the darkest corner of his night. From that night onward, as if bound by a secret vow stitched in the silence of their first meeting, Lily returned again and again, her tiny feet padding softly across the cold grass when the world outside had already sunk into slumber. Her teddy clutched close in one arm while the other struggled to carry pieces of bread wrapped in napkins, a small bottle of water tucked carefully under her arm, and even once, with all the strength her little body could muster, the faded blanket she had pulled from her own bed, its edges frayed from years of being her comfort, now offered without hesitation to a man who had nothing. She would slip through the shadows, her pink frock brushing against the hedges, her hair glowing faintly under the moon, and each time she pushed open the shed door, his weary eyes would lift, not with suspicion, but with the faintest flicker of relief, for though he was the great Alexander Grant, the man whose empire once bent at his command, here he was reduced to hunger, thirst, and loneliness, and yet somehow, this child had become his lifeline. She placed the bread in his rough, trembling hands, her blue eyes wide with sincerity, as she whispered in a voice that carried both innocence and wisdom beyond her years. "Eat, mister. Mommy says hungry people cry inside their heart." He stared at her, the edges of his lips twitching into a smile, weak but real, the kind of smile he had forgotten existed outside of photographs, and he asked with a rasp that carried both gratitude and concern, "And what about you, little one? Don't you get hungry?" She giggled softly, the sound like bells breaking through the darkness, shaking her head as though the thought of her own hunger mattered little, and she answered with a confidence that made his chest ache, "I'll eat later. You're my secret mission." Her words pierced him in ways no rival, no boardroom battle, no corporate betrayal ever had, because in her voice was no agenda, no hidden motive, only the raw truth of a child who believed saving him was as important as saving a world. And so the night stretched on, and each visit became a thread binding them closer. He, the man who once trusted no one, who had walled his heart behind contracts and security gates, now leaned on the kindness of a 6-year-old, surviving because her small hands refused to let him starve. She talked to him about the little things, how the clouds sometimes looked like castles, how her mommy made soup that smelled like hugs, how the stars above seemed to wink at her when she said goodnight. And he listened, truly listened, for the first time in years, his guarded heart softening with every word she spoke. In the cold, damp shed, he began to rediscover the warmth of human connection, not through power or wealth, but through the laughter of a little girl who thought nothing of risking herself for him. He marveled at her courage, her ability to face shadows that would terrify grown men, and he realized that his survival was no longer measured in the food she brought or the water she shared, but in the way her presence reminded him that even in a world poisoned by greed and cruelty, there still existed pure, unshakable kindness. The CEO, once untouchable, once armored in pride and suspicion, was now breathing because of a child's bravery, and as she tucked the blanket around his shoulders one night, yawning as if the weight of her secret mission was pressing on her tiny frame, he felt his heart begin to melt, drop by drop, until he feared it might drown him, not in despair, but in the overwhelming truth that for the first time in his life, someone had chosen him not for his fortune, not for his empire, but for his humanity, and that someone was a golden-haired girl in a pink frock who believed he was worth saving. Days stretched into weeks, and the fragile thread that first tied a child to a fallen man began to weave itself into something stronger, something unspoken yet undeniable. Alexander, once a prisoner of despair, now found himself slowly regaining strength, not only because his body healed with every bite of bread and sip of water Lily carried, but because her presence became a balm to wounds no medicine could touch, and in the quiet hours of their secret meetings, the walls of suspicion and pride he had spent a lifetime building began to crumble. He, the man known across boardrooms as ruthless and unyielding, started to tell her stories. Simple tales about his travels to bustling cities where buildings touched the clouds, about offices filled with voices that chased numbers like treasure, about meetings that stretched long into the night where decisions changed the fate of thousands. Yet when he spoke to her, his tone softened, his sharp words dulled into warmth, because he wanted her to hear not the power of those stories, but the lessons hidden in them. And Lily, wide-eyed, sat cross-legged on the cold floor as though the cracked concrete were a throne, her teddy perched beside her like a loyal listener, nodding with excitement, giggling when his voice grew dramatic, frowning when the story turned heavy, and then answering not with childish nonsense but with dreams that spilled out of her little heart as naturally as breath. She spoke of wishing she had a father who would braid her hair before school, who would clap the loudest at her recitals, who would sit with her under the stars and explain why the moon sometimes looked sad. She whispered of the ache she felt when classmates boasted about their dads, of how she smiled for them but cried quietly when no one noticed, of how she sometimes wished she could draw a daddy with crayons and watch him come alive. And every time she spoke, Alexander's chest tightened, as if her words reached into a part of him he had sealed away, pressing on memories he had long buried. He paused once, mid-story, his breath catching, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said softly, "Sometimes life takes people away, but sometimes life brings them back in ways you don't expect." She tilted her head, not fully grasping the weight of his words, but sensing a heaviness in them that didn't match the gentle tone, and she simply reached for his hand with her small fingers, letting silence say what neither of them knew how to. For him, every smile of hers felt like a déjà vu, a haunting familiarity that stirred in the depths of his being, as though she were not just a child he stumbled upon, but someone tied to his destiny in ways still veiled by shadows. Her laughter echoed like a melody he had heard once before in another life, and each time her eyes met his, he saw a reflection of something he couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. The once powerful CEO, who thought bonds were weaknesses and kindness a currency no one could afford, now found himself waiting for the sound of her footsteps each night, fearing the silence more than his captors, craving her stories about simple things, schoolyard games, her favorite doll, the way rain felt when she danced in it, as though they were treasures greater than gold. And in those shared hours between her innocent confessions and his reluctant truths, a bond grew, not built on contracts or wealth, but on the fragile threads of humanity, longing, and the unspoken hunger for family, and though neither of them fully understood it yet, they were slowly becoming each other's missing piece. The bond that had blossomed in secrecy was suddenly tested on a night when the heavens themselves seemed to wage war, thunder cracking across the sky like angry drums and lightning ripping through the darkness in jagged streaks of fire. The wind howled through the trees around the estate, bending branches like brittle toys, and rain lashed down so violently it blurred the world into shifting shadows. Inside the shed, Alexander felt the air grow tense, his instincts warning him that something dreadful was about to unfold, and his fears proved true when he heard the hurried footsteps of the guards and their harsh voices cutting through the storm, declaring in their native tongue that it was time to move him to another place, one hidden even deeper, where no help could ever find him. Lily, watching from her usual hiding spot, felt her tiny heart pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. For days she had been his secret lifeline, his comfort, his unexpected savior, but tonight she understood that if she did nothing, they would tear him away forever, and the thought of losing him filled her with a terror fiercer than the storm itself. Without thinking, her little legs sprang forward, her teddy bear falling forgotten into the mud, her voice rising high and shrill against the roar of thunder as she screamed at the top of her lungs, words tumbling out in desperate cries for help, her shrill plea carrying across the wet night like a bell of alarm. The villagers, startled by the sound of a child's cry piercing the storm, rushed from their homes, clutching lanterns and torches, their lights scattering golden beams across the rain-soaked darkness, and soon a crowd formed at the edge of the estate, their presence enough to startle the kidnappers, who cursed under their breath and abandoned their plan, fleeing like shadows swallowed by the storm. The shed door burst open, and out stumbled Alexander, drenched and staggering, the rain soaking his torn suit until it clung to him like chains, his face pale, but his eyes burning with disbelief and relief as they fell on the figure standing firm before him. Lily, her pink frock plastered to her small frame, her golden hair plastered to her cheeks by sheets of rain, her tiny body trembling from cold, yet her chin lifted with defiance, courage radiating from her like a flame no storm could extinguish. He dropped to his knees before her, his voice breaking under the weight of everything she had just done, words tumbling out not as a businessman nor a man of power, but as someone humbled to his core. "You saved my life," with more courage than an army. She flung her arms around him without hesitation, her little frame pressed against his, whispering through shivers with the same conviction that had carried her through the darkness. "I told you, mister, I'm your secret mission." The world around them seemed to fade, the storm, the villagers, the fleeing guards, until there was nothing but the fragile embrace of a man who had been broken, and a child who refused to let him fall, and in that embrace, Alexander felt something ignite inside him, not just gratitude, but a deep, unshakable bond, as though fate itself had woven this night to prove that even the smallest hands could carry the greatest strength, and that his life, once measured by fortune and empire, was now indebted to the heart of a little girl who had risked everything for him. The night after the storm, when silence finally replaced chaos, Alexander found himself seated in Claire's small but warm cottage, his body still weak from captivity, yet his heart strangely restless as his gaze traveled across the modest living room. He noticed every detail, the soft embroidery on the curtains, the faint scent of lavender, the old wooden shelf stacked with carefully arranged keepsakes, and then his eyes froze upon a single framed photograph that seemed to pierce through the years, a frozen memory that awakened something long buried. His breath caught, his fingers trembled as he stood and reached for it, his face paling when he recognized himself. Years younger, full of ambition, standing close to Claire, whose smile back then radiated a happiness he hadn't realized he once gave her, and suddenly the air around him thickened, his chest tightening with confusion and a surge of memories, while Claire, standing quietly by the doorway, saw his hands shaking and tears threatening his steady composure, her lips trembling before she finally whispered with a voice that carried the weight of years, "Alexander, that picture. It's not just a memory, it's a truth I never stopped carrying." His eyes snapped to hers, wide with disbelief, his heart hammering in a rhythm louder than the storm outside, and in a broken voice he managed, "Claire, why do you still have this? Why would you keep me close when I abandoned everything?" Her hands clutched the hem of her dress as tears filled her warm brown eyes, spilling down her cheeks like rivers of pain held back for too long, and she answered with a fragile honesty that sliced through him. "Because, Alexander, Lily is your daughter." The words struck him harder than chains ever could, echoing in his mind until he felt the ground tilt beneath him, his knees weakening as he stumbled against the chair, whispering hoarsely, "No, this can't be. My daughter?" But even as he said it, his gaze drifted instinctively toward Lily, who sat in the corner humming softly to her teddy, her golden curls glowing under the dim lamplight, her small fingers wrapped around the toy's arm as if it were her anchor in a vast world. And suddenly everything made sense, the uncanny pull he felt toward her, the familiar sparkle in her blue eyes that mirrored his own, the way her laughter had thawed the ice around his heart, the courage she displayed as though bravery itself ran through her blood. Claire stepped closer, her voice breaking as she continued, "I tried to tell you back then, but you were too busy, too proud, too lost in your empire to listen. When you walked away, I found out I was carrying a piece of you, and I chose to raise her alone rather than beg for love that you weren't ready to give." Alexander's chest heaved as shame and regret poured into him like a flood, his hands covering his face as he whispered again, trembling, "My God, all this time, I had a daughter, and I didn't know. I missed her first steps, her first words, her first smile." His tears spilled freely now, hot and relentless, staining his palms as his whole frame shook with the weight of realization, while Claire sank into the chair opposite him, sobbing into her hands as though years of hidden struggle were unraveling, her voice muffled but aching. "I never wanted to keep her from you, Alexander, but life forced me to choose between chasing after you or protecting her innocence, and I chose her. Every time she asked about her father, I told her he was brave, he was strong, he was someone worth waiting for, even when I wasn't sure if that was true." Alexander raised his head, his blue eyes raw and broken as they lingered on Lily, who looked up curiously at the sudden tears in the room, her small voice carrying across the silence as she asked innocently, "Why are you crying, mister?" His lips quivered, his throat tight, as he whispered almost reverently, "Because, little one, I just learned something more precious than all the wealth in this world. You are mine." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and Claire gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth as Lily tilted her head, confused but smiling. "Yours? Like your secret mission forever?" Alexander nodded, his wubby my babound, whole soul unraveling as he extended a trembling hand toward her, his body aching but his heart desperate. "Yes, Lily. Not just a mission, not just a promise. You are my daughter, my miracle, my second chance." The little girl blinked, her lashes damp from the sudden rush of emotion she didn't fully understand, before she rushed into his arms with the innocence only a child could offer, hugging him tightly, whispering against his chest, "I always wanted a daddy. Maybe God sent you back to me." At that, Alexander finally broke, sobbing openly as he held her close, feeling her tiny heartbeat against his chest, vowing silently that he would never let go again. And though rain still fell outside, inside that humble cottage a truth had blossomed that changed everything, a truth that shattered regret, rewrote memories, and stitched together three broken hearts into a fragile but beautiful family, their tears mingling with hope as the night whispered promises of redemption and love reborn. Alexander's knees pressed into the wooden floor as he lowered himself to Lily's height, his trembling hands barely able to steady against the flood of emotions threatening to drown him, and when her innocent question cut through the silence, "Mister, why are you crying?" His breath faltered, his heart cracked open, and with a voice that carried both confession and plea he whispered, "Because, little angel, I'm not just a man you rescued, I'm your daddy." And the room seemed to pause, time itself holding its breath as the words hung between them, until Lily's wide blue eyes shimmered like glass touched by sunlight, her tiny fingers loosening their grip on the teddy bear that slipped from her grasp and landed softly on the floor, forgotten in the weight of revelation, her lips parting in a gasp so delicate yet so powerful that it shattered the walls of loneliness she had carried silently. "My Daddy?" she breathed, as if the word itself were a treasure she had only dreamed of holding, and before Alexander could speak again, she lunged forward, throwing her fragile arms around his neck with a strength born not of muscle but of unyielding love, pressing her cheek against his as if anchoring him to a truth that could never be taken back. His arms wrapped around her instantly, instinctively, desperately, clutching her as though the years he lost could somehow be reclaimed in that single embrace. his tears streaming freely down his face, soaking her golden hair as he whispered over and over, "I'm here now. I'm here, and I will never let go again." Each syllable a vow etched not in words but in soul, while Claire, standing near the doorway, covered her mouth to stifle the sobs breaking loose from her chest, watching the two halves of her world finally collide into one. The sight both healing and heartbreaking as she realized how long Lily had waited for this embrace, and how long Alexander had lived unaware of the joy he was missing. Lily pulled back just enough to look at him, her small palms cupping his wet cheeks, her gaze steady despite her youth. "Does this mean you'll stay? That you won't disappear like shadows?" she asked with an honesty so raw it pierced him deeper than any wound inflicted by his captors, and Alexander nodded fervently, his voice thick with determination. "I will stay. I swear on everything I have, on every breath, on every heartbeat. You are my daughter, and I am your father, and nothing in this world will take me from you again." And Lily's lips curved into the purest smile, trembling with tears, as she nestled once more into his embrace, whispering into his ear, "Then you're my forever hero." Words so simple yet so profound that Alexander's heart clenched, his chest heaving with sobs that cleansed years of arrogance, loneliness and regret, leaving behind only love so fierce it terrified and healed him at once. Outside, the storm quieted as if nature itself bowed in reverence to the reunion, the rain softening into a gentle drizzle, moon peeking through clouds to cast its silver glow upon father and daughter, locked in a moment that transcended time, while Claire finally stepped closer, her hands trembling as she rested one softly on Alexander's shoulder, her eyes red yet glowing with both sorrow and fragile hope. And for the first time in years, she saw in him not just the powerful CEO the world admired, but the man who once made her laugh under starlit skies. The man who had now crumbled into humility before the miracle of a child, and in that instant she dared to believe that perhaps, despite the scars of their past, love in its purest form could rewrite everything. Alexander, sensing her presence, reached out his other arm, pulling Claire gently into the embrace so that for the first time, the three of them held one another, tears flowing, hearts beating in unison. And though the cottage was small and their lives uncertain, the warmth of that father's embrace lit a fire of belonging that promised no storm, no distance, no mistake could ever extinguish again. Life moved forward not with the heavy silence of regret, but with the tender music of second chances, and Alexander, once the untouchable CEO whose empire seemed carved from stone, now walked through each day with the warmth of small hands in his own. His heart no longer chained to boardrooms and contracts, but to the laughter of a child and the quiet strength of a woman who had once believed she lost him forever. He didn't simply return to his towering office buildings as the man the world feared and admired. He returned as a father, and that truth reshaped every decision, every smile, every breath. For when he looked at Lily, he saw not only the miracle of survival, but the purpose of his existence, and when he looked at Claire, he saw not just the ghost of a love he once abandoned, but the partner fate had given him another chance to cherish. Together they built a new home, not a palace of marble or glass, but a place where love soaked into the walls, where Lily's drawings covered the fridge, where bedtime stories echoed. Louder than corporate strategies and more than wealth, Alexander gave what he had withheld from the world for so long: his time, his devotion, his presence, sitting at her little tea parties, walking her to school, wiping her tears when nightmares chased her. His once iron heart now softened into something unrecognizable even to himself. And when the company gala arrived months later, a night glittering with chandeliers, polished gowns, and cameras flashing like lightning, Alexander stood not as a titan flaunting his empire, but as a man holding his daughter's hand, her pink frock shimmering as she twirled shyly beside him, stealing the spotlight without even trying. And when the reporters circled with their endless questions about profits, mergers, and global influence, he silenced the noise with a smile so genuine it startled those who had only ever seen his steel mask, answering with words that came not from pride but from revelation. "For years I thought my empire was my achievement, but my true victory is being a father to the little girl who saved my life." And in that single declaration, the world glimpsed not Alexander the CEO, but Alexander the man reborn, the father redeemed. The hall erupted in applause, yet he heard none of it, for the only sound that mattered was Lily leaning close, whispering softly with eyes wide and shimmering, "And I'll never let go of my daddy again." Words so small yet so mighty that they silenced every fear he had ever known, and as he tightened his grip around her hand, tears pricked his vision, blurring the flashing lights and glittering gowns until all he could see was her, his daughter, his miracle, his anchor, while Claire, standing gracefully nearby, watched with tears glistening like diamonds, her heart finally healing as she realized they had not just survived their past but had created a new beginning, one forged not from power or wealth but from forgiveness, courage, and love. And so as the night wore on and the crowd celebrated him, Alexander knew the truth. He hadn't only been rescued from chains and guards, he had been rescued from the emptiness of his own soul, pulled back into life by the embrace of a child he never knew he had, a little girl with golden hair and eyes like his who had given him the greatest empire of all, family.